This is Aaron Hops with the Rhinebeck School of Music, and in this lesson we are going to learn how to take a dominant 7 chord in like a jazzy, bluesy context and open that up with a couple of things. One is called triad pairs, and the other is diatonic chord substitution, and I'll explain. So when you're playing a blues or a jazzy kind of blues, and you're playing over these dominant 7 chords, and I'm going to use G7 as an example in this lesson. You can do this with any root off of any dominant 7. You can even do this off of any type of chord. I'm just using a dominant 7 chord as an example because a lot of people like to play bluesy stuff. So if we're talking about functional harmony and diatonic major keys, that G7 would be the 5 chord in the key of C major, right? So G7 is the 5 chord for C major. So what that means is, if you're playing a G7 chord, you can play any of the chords in C major over top of that G7 chord to create more melodic lines and more movement in your chords and even in soloing. So this is what's called diatonic chord substitution, where you're not necessarily thinking about like the G7 chord. Like you can think about the G7 chord and you can think about all the inversions of the G7 chord and extensions of the G7 chord, you know, to kind of open up your playing, and that's all well and good, and that can take you, you know, to a certain point. But this really opens things up in a whole other way. So for example, I'm going to play G7. I'm going to take all my triads in the second inversion on the D, the G, and the B strings, these 3 strings here. All right. So what is that going to give me? It's going to give me right here 3, 4, 3. That's a B diminished, C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, back to B diminished. So the way that I discovered this was a long time ago when I was playing that vamp in the song All Blues by Miles Davis, right? It starts with a G7 chord, it's in 6/8, and you've got this vamp that goes. And I thought to myself, wow, they're playing a G7 chord, but that's just a C major triad. And that's a D minor triad back to a C major triad, and they're just vamping on that, right? And I thought, well, if I'm doing C major, D minor, what if I just keep going up the scale, right? C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished. Nobody really taught me this, like, no teacher taught me this, but then I started to hear things like in blues where you've got a G7 and you have these little triads, right? And then it all kind of clicked and came together that, wow, if I'm playing a G7, I can play any of the chords in C major and any of the inversions of the triads, right? Like here's a G major triad, A minor, B diminished, C major, D minor, E minor. I can play any of these chords and I get these really cool, substitutions. So I'll play a G7. It's pretty cool. And not only that, like you can use these not only as chords, but you can use these as ways to kind of open up your solo playing. So like, I'm just going to take 2 triads because, you can practice all of them in the key, anywhere. C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, You can play these anywhere, like up the diatonic chord progression in C. But if you pair 2 triads, it's a little less daunting of a task. So the 2 over a dominant 7, like in jazz and blues, that work really well are the 2 and the 3 chord of C major. So that would be D minor and E minor. And the reason why that is because the E gives you this nice like 13 extension, and the A gives you this nice 9th chord extension. And those two, the 9s and the 13s, are really good for extensions for blues and jazzy blues, right? So here I've got E minor and D minor, E minor and D minor, E minor and D minor, E minor and D minor. And I'm just going to vamp on this G7 chord, right? So I've got G7. Connect them chromatically if you want. And I threw in some single note lines in there because you can play these as little arpeggios too, to kind of, if you're soloing over a G7 chord, you can arpeggiate. So I'll demonstrate that too. Opens up your playing, so you're thinking less about a scale, right? And scales are great because they show you all the notes that you can play in a certain key or over a certain chord, but also these triads, they like really kind of open up something a little bit more melodic, right? So that's just one position, right? I could take E minor and D minor here and here, in that position. So now I've got this. So sometimes I'm playing them as chords, right? And then sometimes I'm kind of arpeggiating little lines to sort of come up with something a little more interesting, right? So these are all the inversions of my E minor, D minor triad, and then you can also do them here. E minor, D minor, E minor, D minor, E minor, D minor, E minor, D minor. So now I've got something like this. So it's just taking 2 triads, E minor and D minor. And those work really well over your dominant 7. So I was doing this over G7, but obviously you can move this anywhere. Here's my C7. Same shapes, right? Over that same chord position. Right? So I can do this anywhere using any dominant 7. So the idea of it, again, is you take a dominant 7 chord, which, if we're just thinking about this, is not an altered dominant chord, but just has like a bluesy dominant 7 chord that you're kind of vamping on, like in a blues context or a jazz blues context. And you hear it all the time, right? You hear that all the time, right? In blues. So we're just taking that a step further, and we're doing it in different places across the fretboard so that you can come up with really melodic lines. And again, you can use them as single notes, arpeggiating these to really open up your soloing, or you can use them as chords. And it just becomes really melodic. And again, so the dominant 7 is the 5 chord, So if like we're in C7, we're thinking it's the 5 chord for F major, so you're thinking of all of the chords in F major, which would be F major, G minor, A minor, B flat, C, etc. So you can do it with any key, any root, and really just opens up your playing, I think, a lot. It's like really kind of changed my perspective, and really helped me play more melodic things. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. There's a PDF of all this attached for patrons. If you haven't already, visit www.rhinebeckschoolofmusic.com and subscribe to the channel. Become a patron, www.patreon.com/Rhinebeck School of Music, and I'll see you at the next one.